look in the mirror right now. Go on, I'll wait. That face staring back at you, that smooth forehead, that dainty little jawline. You didn't earn that face. Your closet did. Yeah. Your face is basically a receipt for the first coat your ancestors ever stole off a dead animal. Because here's the thing nobody tells you in school. Somewhere around a few 100,000 years ago, your ancestors discovered clothing, and it didn't just keep them warm. It broke their skulls. In a good way. It re-engineered the bone structure of your entire species' head permanently, forever, and you're currently wearing the leftover evidence on your face right now. You are, at this exact moment, the walking result of evolution's biggest home renovation project. And it started with a coat. Okay, so I know what you're thinking. A coat changed my skull? That's insane. That's not how bones work. Bones don't care what you're wearing. And look, I get the skepticism. I'd be skeptical too if I hadn't spent way too long falling down this rabbit hole. But stick with me, because this is one of those facts that sounds like a stretch until you understand the mechanism, and then it sounds so obvious you get mad nobody told you sooner. Think about your phone for a second. Your phone battery drains fast when it's running 15 apps in the background, right? Location services, 5 social media apps, refreshing. Some podcast app you forgot was even open. But the second you close those apps, battery life stretches out. Same hardware, completely different performance, because you freed up resources that were being burned elsewhere. Your ancestors' bodies worked the exact same way. Except instead of apps, they were running a background process called do not freeze to death, and it was eating resources across their entire body. Resources that, it turns out, were being borrowed directly from their skulls. Here's the setup. Before clothing, your body itself was the coat. Every single day, non-negotiably, your ancestors' bodies had to solve, how do I not die of cold using nothing but biology? Body fat, dense hair, and this is the part that matters. A diet and jaw structure built around eating enormous amounts of tough, fibrous, mechanically demanding raw food because you need serious fuel to keep an internal furnace running with zero insulation. That meant a skull built like a tank. We're talking heavy brow ridges, sitting over the eyes like a permanent scowl. Thick jaw muscles anchored deep into bone, and a facial structure that existed less for vibes and more for pure structural survival, built to grind and process food that needed heavy-duty processing, and to physically withstand the daily stress of an unclothed existence in a genuinely brutal climate. Then, and this is the pivot the entire video is about, somebody had the genius idea to stop being the coat and start wearing one instead. Suddenly, thermoregulation wasn't the body's problem anymore. It was the hide's problem. You outsourced it. Just like how you outsource remembering everyone's birthday to your phone calendar instead of your actual brain, your ancestors outsourced heat retention to a dead animal's fur instead of their own biology. And when you outsource a background process that's been draining resources for hundreds of thousands of years, those resources have to go somewhere else. Or in this case, they get to stop being needed at all. That's the moment. That's the hinge point this entire episode lives on, because once the body wasn't spending everything it had just to stay warm and structurally armored, the skull was suddenly free to do something it had never really been allowed to do before. It could change shape, not because evolution decided to make us look nicer. Evolution does not care about your jawline. It could change because the biological excuse for that heavy-duty architecture, the actual functional pressure keeping it locked in place, had just been quietly deleted from the to-do list. And once that pressure is gone, bones do something wild. They stop building what they don't need. All right, let's actually get into the mechanics. Because bones stop building what they don't need is a nice sentence, but it's doing a lot of heavy lifting. And I want you to actually understand it. Not just nod along like it's a fortune cookie. Bone is not a trophy. Bone is not decoration. Bone is, biologically speaking, incredibly expensive real estate. Your body does not build thick, heavy, reinforced bone structure for fun. It builds it because something is demanding it. The same way your phone doesn't run a battery-draining app for fun, it runs it because something, a notification, a location ping, a background sync, is demanding it. Bone actually responds to mechanical stress in real time. There's a whole principle in biology, sometimes called Wolff's Law, that basically says bone remodels itself based on the load placed on it. Heavy, repeated stress, bone thickens and reinforces right where that stress is happening. Remove the stress? The bone has zero biological reason to keep maintaining that reinforcement, so over generations, it doesn't. This is not some fringe theory, by the way. It's the same reason astronauts lose bone density in zero gravity. Remove the load-bearing demand, and the body, being the ruthless efficiency machine that it is, goes cool, don't need that anymore, and starts reallocating. So now rewind back to your Ice Age ancestors before clothing. Their skulls were under serious, constant, compounding mechanical stress from two directions at once. Direction 1, chewing. And I don't mean chewing like you chew a burrito. I mean grinding down raw, fibrous, tough, mechanically brutal food, roots, tubers, sinew, meat, with zero prep. Nothing cooked low and slow, nothing tenderized. That requires an insane amount of jaw force, which requires massive jaw muscles, which requires a skull with the bony architecture to anchor those muscles, thick ridges, a robust jaw, a face built like scaffolding around a wrecking ball. Direction 2, raw structural survival. A face and skull unprotected from a genuinely hostile climate and physical environment took a beating, literally, structurally over a lifetime, and needed reinforcement just to hold up. Both of those pressures are basically screaming the same instruction at the skeleton, over and over. For hundreds of thousands of years, build reinforcement. Build reinforcement, build reinforcement, then clothing shows up. And clothing doesn't touch the chewing thing directly. I want to be clear, this isn't a clothing-made food soft story. That's a different invention, a different video. We're not doing that today. What clothing does do is remove that second pressure almost entirely. The body no longer has to treat its own skull and face as unprotected, exposed, load-bearing survival architecture against the raw elements. That job got handed off to a hide. And when a body-wide, evolutionarily ancient stress source just vanishes. You don't need a scientist to tell you what happens next. You need a landlord. Because the second you stop paying rent on something, the building starts getting repurposed. It's honestly the biological version of moving out of an apartment where you were paying for a home gym, a doorman, and a pool, and moving somewhere that just handles all three for you through a cheaper monthly service. Your budget, i.e., your body's energy and material resources, doesn't just sit there unused, it gets reallocated. Immediately. Ruthlessly. Somewhere else in the system that actually still needs it. And here's the detail that should genuinely make your brain short-circuit for a second. This wasn't a slow, vague, over millions of years, who knows, kind of shift. Anthropologists point to this stretch broadly across the transition into anatomically modern humans as a period where facial robusticity, that's the fancy word for how thick and heavy-duty your face bones are, which, yes, is a real term, and yes, it sounds like a wrestling move dropped in a way that lines up suspiciously well with archaeological evidence of hide-working tools. Scrapers, awls, the kind of tools you'd use to turn dead animal into wearable animal. So you've got tool evidence for clothing showing up in the archaeological record, and skull evidence for lighter, less reinforced faces showing up right around the same evolutionary neighborhood. That's not a coincidence science is comfortable calling a coincidence. That's a before and after photo, except the after photo is your face. Now, I want to pump the brakes for 1 second because I promised you real science, not vibes-based science. Is this a single clean light switch moment where humans put on a coat on a Tuesday and skulls started shrinking by Friday? No, obviously not. Evolution doesn't work on a deadline. This was a gradual pressure release valve, playing out across many, many generations, layered on top of other things happening to the human diet and lifestyle at the same time. But the mechanism, stress drives bone density. Removing stress removes the demand for that density. That part isn't speculative. That's basic, well-established skeletal biology. We're just applying it to one very specific, very personal case study, which is you, sitting there, with a face. Okay, so here's where it gets good. Here's the part that actually reframes everything. Because so far you're thinking cool, less stress, smaller face, got it, makes sense. But that's only half of what happened. Removing a cost is only interesting if you know what got bought with the refund. Because your skull didn't just shrink, it renovated. Picture your skull as a fixed monthly budget. For hundreds of thousands of years, a massive chunk of that budget was going straight into structural reinforcement, thick brow ridges, heavy jaw anchoring, dense facial bone. Non-negotiable expenses. Rent that had to be paid every single generation or you didn't survive. Clothing shows up and slashes that bill. And here's the thing about a freed-up budget. It doesn't just evaporate. In a biological system, that energy and material investment gets redirected toward whatever else is providing a survival advantage. And it just so happens that around this same stretch of human evolution, there was an enormous advantage available to anyone willing to invest in it: a bigger, more complex brain. I need you to sit with that for a second, because I don't think it gets nearly enough credit. Your skull wasn't just downsizing the jaw department. It was doing a full corporate restructuring, cutting the brute structural survival budget, and quietly funneling that investment upstairs into the processing power department. Your cranium, the actual dome part of your skull housing your brain, had room to expand. Not because clothing directly grew your brain, let's be clear. That's not the claim. Brain expansion is its own tangled, multi-causal story involving diet, social complexity, cooking, a bunch of other factors way too big for one video. But a lighter, less mechanically over-engineered face and jaw removed a structural constraint that had been boxing the cranium in for a very long time. Less demand for a fortress face meant more architectural freedom for the vault sitting right above it. It's like, okay, you know how when a company stops sinking money into maintaining some giant outdated physical office nobody uses anymore, and suddenly there's this pile of freed up capital sitting there. And instead of just doing nothing with it, they pour it into R&D? That's not a perfect metaphor. Evolution doesn't hold board meetings, I know. But the pattern, resource freed up here, reinvested advantageously there, is real. And it's exactly what your skull did to itself. So here's the wait. This is the part that gets you moment, the one this whole video's been walking toward. You didn't just get a smaller face because clothing kept you warm. You got a bigger brain case, structurally speaking, because clothing kept you warm. The jawline you see in the mirror and the forehead sitting above it are two sides of the exact same historical transaction. One got smaller so the other could get bigger. Your face is the before, your cranium is the after, and the receipt connecting them is a piece of stitched animal hide that some genius ancestor of yours figured out how to wear. And I want to be honest with you about something, because Section 3 of my own brain is yelling at me to be careful here. This is genuinely one of the more debated corners of paleoanthropology. Nobody's sitting there with a smoking gun fossil that says, skull shrunk here, signed, clothing, what we have is a convergence of evidence. Skeletal biology that we understand extremely well from modern medicine and other species. Archaeological tool evidence for hide working showing up in a very suggestive time frame, and a fossil record showing facial robusticity decreasing in that same general evolutionary window. Scientists are still very much in an ongoing, decades-long group chat argument about exactly how much weight clothing gets versus diet, cooking, social behavior, and a dozen other overlapping factors, all shoving human evolution in similar directions at similar times. But the core mechanical relationship, less structural stress demand equals less bone reinforcement equals more room elsewhere in the skull. That's not up for debate. That's just how bone works, in you, right now, today. We're not inventing new biology to make a fun story. We're pointing an already true biological rule at one of the weirdest, most specific places it applies, which is, again, your face, specifically yours, not a generic ancient skull in a museum case. The actual bone structure currently holding your eyeballs in place. Every time you've ever complained about your jaw or your chin, or wished your face looked a little different, you were essentially filing a complaint against a coat that was invented before written language existed. Take it up with your extremely distant, extremely cold, extremely resourceful relatives. They traded your ancestors' battle armor face for your ancestors' bigger brain. And then that brain went on to invent group chats, dating apps, and eventually, several 100,000 years later, a stick figure explaining all of this to you through a screen. Kind of a wild return on investment, honestly. So let's actually sit with this for a second, because I've been cracking jokes for 3 straight sections, and I don't want that to bury the part that actually matters. Every single person you have ever loved, every face you've ever memorized, every stranger you passed on the street today, all of you are walking around wearing the physical aftermath of a decision made by people who never met you, who couldn't have imagined you, who were just trying to survive one more brutal winter with nothing but their own bodies and, eventually, the skin of an animal they'd killed. They didn't know they were reshaping the human skull. They weren't thinking about brain cases or facial robusticity or any of the vocabulary we just spent 10 minutes unpacking. They were cold. That's it. That's the whole motivation. They were cold, and they solved it, and solving it rippled forward through hundreds of thousands of years and landed, of all places, on your face in a mirror on a random day, doing something as mundane as brushing your teeth. That's the part that gets me every time I think about this. Evolution doesn't plan ahead. It doesn't have a vision board. It just responds to whatever pressure is currently in the room and removes what's no longer earning its keep. And yet somehow that blind, patient, reactive process took a practical decision about staying warm and turned it into more room for the exact organ that would eventually let humans wonder why their face looks the way it does. You're not just descended from people who survived the cold. You are built structurally, physically, out of the fact that they stopped having to. There's something almost unbearably intimate about that. Your face isn't just yours. It's a shared inheritance, quietly renegotiated by every generation that came before you, one animal hide at a time. You didn't choose this jawline, you didn't choose this forehead, but you are, in a very real sense, the final draft of a project your ancestors started when they got tired of freezing. That's not a flaw. That's not something to complain about in a mirror. That's evidence written directly into your bones, that your ancestors solved a problem so completely that their descendants got to stop paying for it, forever. You're not just surviving winter anymore. You're the proof that someone a very long time ago already won that fight for you. All right, so now that you know your own face is basically a receipt, go look in the mirror again. I'm serious, actually do it, and tell me down in the comments what part of this broke your brain the hardest. Was it the less jaw, more brain trade? Was it the fact that a coat did this? I want to know which detail made you stop scrolling and just stare at your own face like a stranger for a solid 10 seconds, because if it happened to you, it happened to me too. And honestly, that's the whole reason this channel exists. But here's the thing, this episode very deliberately did not touch, and it's been sitting in the back of my mind this entire time. We talked about the skull, we talked about the face, we talked about clothing, outsourcing your thermoregulation and freeing up room for your brain to expand. We did not talk about what happened when your ancestors also started cooking their food. Because if raw, tough, fibrous food is what demanded that heavy-duty jaw and skull architecture in the first place, and clothing only solved half of that equation, the climate half, then what happens to a skull when the food itself stops fighting back? What happens when chewing stops being a full-contact sport? That's a whole separate renovation, a whole separate trade, and it might be an even bigger one. So, same time, next episode, bring your jaw. It's about to have some questions.